Hello and welcome to the second of NCSL's Employment, Labor, and Retirement Summer Webinar Series. Last week, we talked about occupational licensing. This week, we are going to be talking about the minimum wage. So just to make sure that you're all with me here, let's get started with a quick poll question. Let me queue up that poll. All right, so our poll question that we have before us is, how many states have a minimum wage below the federal minimum rate? Again, that's how many states have a minimum wage below the federal rate. And while you're doing that, I do want to draw your attention to two key features in the Zoom platform. The first is the Q&A. We have excellent panelists lined up for you today, so please drop any questions in that section that you would like to have our panelists answer. And the second is our chat function. So let me know that you found that chat function by typing in the name of the state that you're joining us from. While you're doing that, let's go back to our poll question. Again, we're asking how many states have a minimum wage below the federal rate? So it looks like 0. Most people are thinking 0. 5 came in as a close-ish second. So the answer is actually 2. 2 states have a minimum wage below the federal rate. This is Georgia and Wyoming, each with $5.15 per hour. Of course, the federal minimum wage is a wage floor, so the $7.25 rate applies in both of those states. So today we're going to be talking about federal and state efforts surrounding the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. But before we get into that, let's look at our federal overview and a little bit of history. So in 1938, the minimum wage is first established under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is signed into law by then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It does many things, among them establishing, again, that federal minimum rate, which at the time is 25 cents per hour. When the Fair Labor Standards Act is first signed, not every worker is covered under that act, so there are several exemptions. Over time, we see this primarily in the 60s and in the 70s. The Fair Labor Standards Act is amended, and this is usually either to raise that wage rate or to expand coverage to those workers who had been exempt under the initial piece of legislation. Fast forwarding a little bit here, our last federal action comes in 2007. This is under President George W. Bush, who signs HR 2206. This is a large spending bill, but within it, it has a provision that raises the minimum wage over the course of the next 2 years to its current rate now, which sits at $7.25. And again, that went into effect in 2009. So since then, we haven't seen any increases. Overall, this amounts to 22 increases by 12 separate presidents. Today, when we look at action at the federal level, what we see are iterations of what is called the Raise the Wage Act. So the most current iteration of that act, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021, it does 3 kind of main things. First, it proposes a minimum wage increase to $15 per hour by 2025. Second, it expands coverage, minimum wage coverage. So as I talked about earlier, there are still groups that are exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this Raise the Wage Act would expand coverage to include people with disabilities, as well as student workers. Those are workers that are age 20 and younger, who currently can make these what we call sub-minimum wage, so less than the federal minimum. So it would eliminate those exemptions. And then lastly, it would take the cash wage, or the wage that we give to tipped workers, and it would slowly align that with the federal minimum wage. Turning now to the states, you can see that there's a lot happening here. So the minimum wage has largely been a state-driven issue, and you can see that from this map. the minimum wage law changes since 2014. We've seen at least 28 states, as well as the District of Columbia, change their minimum wage laws since 2014. And this is, again, a state issue, but it's even more local than that. At least 45 localities within the states have wage rates that are higher than their state's minimums. We see these predominantly in large metropolitan areas. So we see this concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area, around Seattle, New York City, and other locations similar to those. Overall, 30 states and DC have wages that are higher than that current federal minimum of $7.25. As you've probably heard a lot about, and as a major sticking point in the federal piece of legislation, states are moving broadly to propose changes raising their wage rates to $15 per hour. And we have seen at least 8 states, as well as DC, approve measures which incrementally increase those wage rates to $15 per hour. Currently, only DC has this in effect, but effective January 1 of next year, California will become the first state with a statewide $15 minimum wage. So that is kind of the landscape, what's going on at the federal and at the state level. For more on this, I am joined by 2 excellent panelists who I have the pleasure of introducing to you now. Let me stop sharing here. I'm joined by Ardeen Williams, who is the Vice President of Workforce Development for Amazon. In her role, Ardeen advises teams and businesses across Amazon on talent, attraction, and development. Ardeen's work focuses heavily on accelerating Amazon's upskilling programs, including Career Choice, which has helped thousands of Amazonians retrain for careers in high-demand fields. Previously, Ardeen was Vice President of Talent Acquisition for Amazon Web Services, where she scaled the recruiting capability for Amazon's rapidly growing cloud computing business, including strengthening AWS's pipeline of military and veteran talent through their innovative Department of Labor certified apprenticeship programs. Ardeen has more than 35 years of leadership experience across the tech industry, and she has held roles in product development and marketing, corporate business management, M&A, and HR. Prior to joining Amazon, she served as Intel's Vice President of HR Enterprise Services, and she began her career as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1983. Thank you so much for joining us, Ardeen. And we are also joined by Glenn Spencer. Glenn Spencer is the Senior Vice President of the Employment Policy Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He oversees the Chamber's work on a number of issues, including wage and hour. Before joining the Chamber in 2007, Glenn spent 6 years at the U.S. Department of Labor, serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff to then Secretary of Labor, Elaine Chao. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us. A quick programming note, we were slated to have Senator Walsh with us today, but it's their last day of session there in Delaware. So as you can imagine, very busy day, and got pulled back in to business on the floor. But without further ado, let's get started with some panelist questions. So how this will run is I will ask a question, I'll give you both an opportunity to respond, and then we'll open it up for kind of open discussion. And I may ask follow-up questions during that time, but it'll also give you an opportunity to respond to one another. So Ardeen, what is Amazon's position on raising the minimum wage and why? We know that they've been a vocal supporter of both efforts at the state and at the federal level. So what is their position and how did that come to be?
Now that I'm unmuted. Thanks, Sage. First, thanks for having us here and looking forward to the conversation. Our position is pretty simple, raising wages to at least $15 an hour. It's good for business, it's good for workers, it's good for customers, and it's good for our economy. At Amazon, we decided we wanted to lead in the wage area. And the first step we did was to raise our starting wage to $15 an hour in November of 2018. And for us, it was important not only to lead on wages, but also to support federal and state legislation to increase the floor wage in the country. Since we raised our wages in November of 2018, we've seen very positive impact on our business, our employees, and the communities of which we're a part. On our, for our business, when employees, when there's an opportunity for a $15 wage, we saw an improvement in both attraction and retention. So not only is it easier to attract employees, but to retain them, which also boosts productivity because you aren't continually ramping new and replacing employees. And when workers are able to focus on their jobs and on serving customers, instead of worrying about how they're going to pay bills, businesses of all sizes and communities benefit. And our employees who are paid $15 or more an hour have told us that that wage change was literally life-changing. They're able to save for unexpected expenses, to pay for car repairs, increase their rent, for example, move into a larger space, pay for tuition, lots of things that were simply out of reach before. And when they have discretionary spending, the great thing is that gets pumped into the local communities where we're a part as well. Then that increased spending capability for our employees actually helps drive and fuel growth in other local businesses. We've also seen other major companies increase their wages to $15 an hour or more, and we encourage every major corporation to take that step because it puts money in the pockets of people who need it the most, increases consumer spending, and with local businesses, and helps grow the economy.
And Glenn, you represent, obviously, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, representing business interests across the country. Where is the Chamber of Commerce on this issue?
Typically, the Chamber has been opposed to increases in the minimum wage. That started to change a couple of years ago when we took a much closer look at the issue. Now, of course, as the U.S. Chamber, we're mostly looking at what the federal government does as opposed to what the states do. That said, we did oppose the Raise the Wage Act because we thought for setting the federal floor, $15 was probably a little too high for some businesses, certainly not for all. And so we opposed the bill. But that said, we were pretty public about the fact that when that bill was introduced, we were certainly open to a relatively substantial increase in the minimum wage. Certainly $7.25 is too low in the current environment. Congress does come back from time to time and raise the minimum wage, and there's no reason why they shouldn't look at that issue on a regular basis. So what we said was, if you take a more moderate approach to setting the federal floor, that's the kind of thing that the U.S. Chamber, and I think a lot of other business groups, would be in favor of and would support. Congress is still debating what that number ought to be. Obviously, we all saw what happened to the Raise the Wage Act. It passed the House, didn't go anywhere in the Senate. They tried to do 15 through reconciliation. That didn't fly with the Senate parliamentarian. So there's still conversations going on the Senate side in particular about what that number should be, what the federal floor should be. One of the things we would like to see is, as you raise that wage, you also look at some reforms to the Fair Labor Standards Act itself. There are definitely some outdated provisions in that statute. For example, the description of a computer employee was written back in the 70s when you actually had some people with computers and most people didn't have them. Nowadays, everybody's a computer employee. So what does that exemption in the FLSA actually mean? It's time to look at some of those kind of things in the statute and pair that with the increase in the minimum wage. Typically what Congress has done is said, here's some small business tax credits, and we'll use that to offset the impact on smaller businesses. We think that's great, but it's time to take a broader look at the statute itself and use the opportunity of raising the minimum wage to make some of those adjustments to modernize the statute.
So Glenn, you mentioned a more moderate kind of approach to raising wages, something likely below 15. Ardeen, I want to ask you, you were at the table when this change was made. How did you guys land on 15? Why 15 specifically?
When we looked at our wages across the country, and I think Glenn makes an important point, there's a federal floor, and then the cost of labor varies dramatically across the country. I mean, our starting minimum wage is $15 an hour, And yet more than half of our employees are paid an average wage of $16 or more, because there are areas, as you pointed out when you began, where the cost of labor is significantly higher than the federal floor. And when we looked at it, $15 was a reasonable step from our average wage that we were already paying. And it was a figure that actually, pushed us in some areas to pay a little bit more, but was very consistent with what our total compensation was across the country.
And Glenn, I want to ask you, I want to go to our second question now, because you did raise the issue of small businesses. As we know, the pandemic unleashed a devastating wave of unemployment. It upended major sectors of the US economy. And today, the unemployment rate sits at about 5.8%. And many employers, including 48% of small businesses, indicate difficulty attracting new workers. So I'm curious, what role do you think wages has in this, if any?
Yeah, you've hit on a really important point in today's economy, which is that businesses are having trouble hiring workers. From almost every company we talk to on a daily basis, they tell us that's their number one concern, is finding enough people. In response to that, you have seen wages go up in a number of industries and a number of businesses. We think that's totally appropriate. Companies ought to be able to set a wage that works for them and a wage that will help them attract the talent that they need. The one caveat I'd put in there is that for some businesses, there is a point at which you really can't raise wages anymore and remain profitable. And so for those industries and those companies, we just need to be a little bit cautious about where we try and set that federal floor. And again, those businesses can only raise it so high to attract workers before the marginal value that's produced by those workers just doesn't allow the business to sustain itself. Obviously, for a company like Amazon, they have a bigger payroll. They have a more money that they can use to compensate workers. And so that's great that they're doing that. Other companies are in the same boat. We've seen a lot of larger retailers start to raise wages. We've seen companies in the fast food industry do the same thing, where they're offering bonuses just for people to come in and interview. And so they're being forced to also provide higher wages. Again, we think that's a natural market mechanism. The cost of labor is a price signal to employers as to what they need to pay to attract workers. But we just want to be cognizant of the fact that, again, in some industries and for some businesses, wages can only go so high before they're just actually not making enough money to keep the business viable.
So Glenn, you say, businesses ought to be able to set their own wage, but a federal kind of standard may not be necessary or needed for all companies, right? Because it'll impact companies differently. Ardeen, Amazon has been a very vocal proponent. Not only have they raised wages for their own workers, but have advocated actively at the federal level and across the states. Can you talk a little bit more about those efforts and why you guys are engaging in this rather than raising wages for just Amazon employees?
But when we raised our wages for our employees, we also raised it for those that provided contract services to Amazon. And I think Glenn makes an important point. There are industries where margins are tight. Fast food has probably got one of the slimmest margins that there is. I mean, margin in that business is primarily on beverages, and those are industries where we're seeing very recently some pretty significant increases. I think what we saw from COVID was the exposure of existing issues in the system. And, I think wages play a part in it. Our customers, what we hear from customers, from our stakeholders, is that their employees like ours are having difficulty with things like, because they're essential workers, with school not being in session, with access to daycare. And so wages play a part, but there's a complex problem here that we're working to address. I think that raising the wages, as I said before, it's good for business, good for employees, and good for the communities. And there's really three reasons from our perspective to advocate to raise those wages. First, people need it. When you look at the federal minimum wage at $7.25, that means that people who are working full-time, so 2,000 hours a year, are making just slightly above the federal poverty level for a family of one. And they're below the poverty level for a family of two, which makes it really difficult to provide housing and food for a family of more than one person at a wage of $7.25 an hour. Second, when we said, hey, that increasing the minimum wage not only puts money in the pockets of employees, but it also helps fund those local businesses. Those, the 80% of employers, or 80% of Americans are employed by small and medium-sized companies. And when you increase local spending, you actually help increase the revenue for those businesses, and you create this great economic flywheel. Polls show that the American people want to raise the minimum wage. We just completed a poll with Ipsos. 80% of Americans say that the minimum wage is too low. They've been wage increases have been incredibly popular. It's been like 23, and you can correct me, Sage, I think there've been like 23 raise the wage opportunities since 1998, and every one of them has passed. And 2/3 of Americans think that $15 an hour is probably not too high a rate for a minimum wage. And then third, the economy needs it. I think when you start to put money back into the pockets of people, it has an overall effect on the economy that I talked about. And I think the other piece that's important is to think about, when you have people working at the poverty level or just below, the cost of our social safety net programs. And as you start to raise the wage, you do a couple of things. Again, you increase the viability of local businesses, and you increase tax revenue. And when you raise people's wages, you also decrease the reliance on those social safety nets. So local, state, and federal governments see a net positive lift from that. Now, it doesn't happen overnight, just like the wage doesn't go from 7.25 to 15 overnight. It's going to take time for this to work through the system. But for those three reasons, we really viewed raising the wage, our wage, to $15, and the wage for our suppliers and contractors to $15 as a great way to start that flywheel moving better for our economy.
Glenn, I'm curious if you have a response.
Yeah, I think Ardeen raises a really good point about the way that the increases should be phased in, which is something you saw in the Raise the Wage Act, that it doesn't go from $7.25 to $15 overnight. That would be 107% boost in labor costs, in 1 year, which obviously a lot of businesses would have a problem with. So the idea that you phase it in over time, I think, is an effective way to look at that. We did find with the Raise the Wage Act that the way those increases were stepped in was still fairly steep. I think in the first year, the bump up would have been something around 35% of labor costs, which we thought was rather high. Whereas if you got to a slightly more moderate wage level, the increases are a little bit more acceptable, probably easier to deal with for employers, and in particular, more consistent with where Congress has set those levels from time to time. In other words, the percentage increases per year, if you went to a lower number than 15, would be consistent with where Congress has been in the past. So I think that the phase in is an important point to remember. One thing that gets lost in this discussion, though, which I did want to mention here, is the idea of this tipped minimum wage, which you raised at the start of the conversation. That there are a lot of employees who receive tips as part of their compensation, and therefore the base wage rate is set at a much lower level. We do think that number can go up too. I think it's at $2.35 now, somewhere around that. Very low, hasn't been raised in a long time. That number can probably go up. We don't think, however, that you ought to eliminate that as a means of compensation and just raise it up to 15 along with everybody else. You ought to be able to maintain that tipped minimum wage. One thing to remember about that, of course, is not that a minimum wage worker who's getting $2.35 per hour as the base rate doesn't mean that's what they're earning. They always get the minimum wage. Employers have to provide them with if they're not earning enough in tips to at least get to that minimum wage number. Employers do have to make that up. We saw in a couple of states, well, the District of Columbia and Maine looked at eliminating that tipped wage. Workers actually didn't want that. They were opposed to those initiatives. So we think that's an important part of the discussion that sometimes gets lost. And again, we would say that you probably need to raise that number. $2.35 is clearly too low. Where you set it is open to some discussion. I think senators are still talking about that as well, as to what they should do with that tip minimum.
That's a really important issue, Glenn, and it's hugely complex in the food industry right now, particularly restaurant, because you have front of house and back of house. And where you have front of house, even at that $2.35 or it's around there. I'm not sure of the exact number. On a good shift, you can have employees where the establishment is letting them, either they're pooling tips or they're taking all their tips. They're making a significant wage, where back of house are not. And so this is also one of the things the industry wrestles with, is how do you manage that difference, the delta between front of house and back of house? Because you can't run a restaurant without back of house. So back of house are the people who wash dishes, who bus, who are doing, you know, some of the food prep ahead for the chef. And so thinking about how we also help businesses, and this is a role you guys can play, how do you help the hospitality industry figure out the right kinds of balance and mechanism to either pool that tip or raise the back of house wage so that it's more equitable, so that they're able, you know, restaurateurs are able to staff the entire restaurant. So again, it's one of those really complicated problems that if you look at just one piece of it, it's easy to lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, that minimum cash wage of $2.13, which, as you both have mentioned, has not been raised in a very long time. I'm curious to, you know, we hear all the time about raising wages and its impact on employment. So Glenn, I want to ask you a little bit about that. The Congressional Budget Office, as you mentioned, released a report outlining the potential impact of raising the minimum wage at 3 different levels. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit more about that analysis for us.
Yeah, and that's sort of our go-to analysis too, is to look at what the CBO said about going to 15, and they did predict that there would be job losses. They predict also that there would be workers who benefit from that, and so it's trying to find the careful balance between not causing too much in the way of job loss and getting the maximum benefit out of it for the largest number of workers as you raise that wage, which again is where that helped lead us to the place where we said, yes, we acknowledge there should be an increase, and actually we're supportive of it, but helped us get to a place where we thought there's a more moderate number to get to that in the economy overall wouldn't result in as much of the job loss as the CBO projected.
And our panelist, of course, Senator Walsh was unable to join us, but he did sponsor Senate Bill 15, which recently was signed into law, making Delaware the 8th state that has a minimum wage that will be $15 effective in January of 2025. Ardeen, I know that Amazon was involved in that effort. Can you talk a little bit about your state and local efforts regarding raising the minimum wage?
So I think first I want to just thank Senator Walsh, even though he's not here, for his effort in supporting this. I think, as Glenn has pointed out, you know, one size doesn't fit all, and really helping businesses understand what the benefit is to them. You know, the CBO study talked about, you know, where's that happy medium between job gain and job loss, and I know that what we've seen in communities that do raise the minimum wage is that you see the number of part-time positions perhaps shrink, but the number of full-time positions increase. And so when you start to look at total hours worked, in addition to number of positions, it's actually perhaps a finer way to take a look at the problem. I think as we you know, Virginia is moving towards an increased minimum wage as well, and understanding what the local requirements are across the diversity of the Commonwealth is important. And that's the same approach that Amazon has taken in Delaware, is understanding what the as is in the state, where the opportunities are, and then listening to business to understand what that scale increase could be. And then are there opportunities for us to help along with the local chambers who do a great job providing business consulting. So to understand, you know, what it can take to create more full-time positions than a lot of part-time positions. So I think it's building that coalition and working locally to understand the problem across the state, and then working with legislators to understand what the right action is overall for the state, because you can't optimize for every part, right? You end up sub-optimizing for some. And then I think the third, to understand how as a community, you know, it's a team sport, how as a community do we help bring not only employees along, but businesses who have to understand how to implement the change and how to accommodate the differences that are coming.
Excellent. So I just want to remind folks to jump in at any time to ask any any questions of our panelists here. Excuse me. Ardeen, I know Amazon has also worked with businesses for a fair minimum wage. Can you talk a little bit more about that group and that partnership?
So again, it's understanding from businesses where they currently are, and again, revenue models are different for every business, as are margins. And then I think the other piece is sitting down and understanding the challenges on both sides of the equation, because in many cases, and I find this on the workforce development front where I do a lot of my work as well, is it's a tomato conversation. And meaning, hey, we both see the problem, we just understand it a little differently, and getting businesses and legislators together to have that conversation along with people who have walked the road before. So by bringing in businesses who have voluntarily raised their wages to talk about the benefits that it has yielded for them with respect to retention, attraction, the ability to provision benefits, to increase employee contributory benefits. I think that providing that kind of help has been important to it as well.
Excellent. So I do not see any questions in our Q&A. I'm curious, as we kind of bring it to a close here, any final thoughts from our panelists before we wrap up? I'll start with you, Glenn.
Yeah, sure. Again, we at the chamber do believe it's time to look at raising the minimum wage. I think Ardeen and I would both agree $7.25 is a national floor. Way too low. Hasn't gone up since 2009. It's time to take a look at that. One of the things that I get a little worried about when you look at how Congress approaches this issue is it tends to be this all or nothing approach, right? You saw coming out of the House, it was $15, that's it, end of story, no compromise, that they were willing to entertain. Goes over to the Senate, of course, totally different political dynamic there. And the concern we have is that when you insist on it's our bill or nothing, you may wind up with nothing. And that's what's happened in some previous Congresses too, where there were discussions about raising the minimum wage, and it was the Raise the Wage Act with $15, and it wound up not passing at all. And so we're stuck with $7.25. So we've been encouraging folks to think a little creatively, compromise on some of the numbers, and maybe the more FLSA reform you add in, the higher the number could go. But those discussions are still ongoing, and hopefully we can get to some kind of agreement around a reasonable increase that actually does the job and actually raises the minimum wage from $7.25 to a more reasonable number. Because again, it's been a long time and that number is way too low.
So I think, Glenn is spot on. Democracy is about compromise, and it's about understanding how to thread the needle to get the best result overall. And we're a country of very broad differences in terms of labor cost. I mean, if you look at Washington State and just move from the concentric circle of Seattle to King County to the broader state, the difference in the poverty level is astonishing. And so understanding what the right labor costs are for that state is incredibly important. And then how the legislature, who are in the state legislature in the best position to understand what's going on in the state, set that wage increase. But the federal floor is too low. We're strong advocates for $15 an hour. We have an employee base of over 1 million employees, and they're spread across the country. And I know that our average starting wage across the country is more than $16 now. So we're comfortable with $15. But again, I think democracy is about compromise and about making sure that as a community, we advocate for what makes sense for our citizens, and we help our businesses and communities thrive.
Excellent. And we actually, in those final wrap-up thoughts, received 2 questions in the chat. So I do want to pose those to you quickly before I let you go while I still have you. The first is, given the lack of movement in Congress on the minimum wage, which we've obviously talked about in our discussion here, are there other avenues worth exploring that can help workers achieve wage gains, such as education, additional education and training? And I want to kick that to you, Ardeen, first, because I know you do head that work for Amazon.
So we, as a second largest private employer in the country, we think we have a role to play in creating good jobs. And good jobs for us are a fair wage, egalitarian benefits from day one, and access to upskilling. And so that's part of that three-legged stool. So absolutely education and upskilling plays a role, because we know that when you add skills to experience, you put employees on a career path, whether that's with us or with another company. I don't think it's an or. I actually think that creating good jobs comprises those three things. I think that the way that we move the country forward is absent action in Congress. Glenn is far more savvy in that area than I am, so I'm going to defer to his assessment. I think you look to large companies to raise wages, and you're seeing that happen. You saw it, it's not just Amazon. It's Amazon, Target, Best Buy, Costco. I mean, these are companies that are moving in the same direction, and they're large employers, and that creates that economic environment in the locality that actually pushes wages up, and we've seen that. The second piece is at the state level, the state and local level, and state legislatures are very connected to their constituents, and they're in a position to take steps. And you've seen that. We have many states across the country that have a minimum wage of greater than $7.25. And so I think that those are, I don't think you can say, hey, I'm going to give you training, so I'm not going to pay you, because that doesn't do anything to put a roof over your head or to buy groceries for your children. So I think that it's an and, not an or. But I think that those other two methods are really ways that we can advance the ball while we're waiting for Congress to take action.
And Glenn, what are your thoughts on that? Are there other avenues worth exploring?
Well, I think Ardeen is right. It shouldn't be an or, it really is an and, because the way you really get lasting, sustainable increases in wages is by increasing productivity. And you do that through investments in capital, but also investing in workers and training them and educating them and upskilling them. That helps them be more productive. And that's really the way you get sustainable increases in earnings. But it shouldn't be an or, right? I mean, that goes in conjunction with the work that Congress ought to be doing around providing an increase in the minimum wage. And again, we're hopeful that we can get to some kind of compromise on this. Otherwise, we wind up in another situation where the increase is going to be zero. And that's not where we want to be. And as a country, I don't think that's where we ought to be. So hopefully we can continue to work that process and get to a increase that actually makes sense and that, you know, Congress can get done.
And our final question, of course, our audience is state policymakers. So I want to ask both of you what, and Ardeen, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, what should state policymakers take into consideration when they are looking at raising the minimum wage in their state?
Glenn, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. So, you know, again, most of our work is at the federal level, but some of that translates into the way that state legislatures might want to look at this issue, whatever it is they decide to do in terms of the number. A couple of things to consider. One would be what you do with that tip minimum wage, if you retain that, and we would argue that you should, even if you do raise it. Second thing to look at would be, do you do an inflation adjustment, right? Do you want the legislature to have to go back every 2, 3, 5 years, or in our case in Congress, you know, what is it, 12 years now, and try and increase it? Or do you build in some kind of inflation adjustment? If you do that, a key consideration is what index you use. There's a number of different options you would have, but picking the right index is going to be pretty important. And I also think you would want to look at, within certain states, what are the regional variations? You mentioned that there's a number of cities that have raised their wages higher than where the state is. And that may make a lot of sense depending on what state you're in and how your state economy develops. You know, there's a big difference between $15 in San Francisco and $15 in, you know, Bakersfield or somewhere. So you may want to look at whether you do some type of regional variation in the wage. That gets tricky in some areas, but it's certainly worth looking at it as a state considers how to approach this issue.
I think those are great suggestions, and I think that this is the beauty of the government that we have. Right, we have the flexibility to create this federal floor that we both agree is too low and is sat for too long. And you have the flexibility of states to raise the state minimum wage, and then local governments, whether it's at the county or city level, to make appropriate adjustments to the wage. And I think that the steps that are important, in addition to what Glenn said, I'm just going to state the obvious. It's what the audience that's here does best. It's listening to constituents. It's working with small and medium-sized businesses to understand where they are, to understand if you've got that tipped wage at front of house, how are you going to make sure that you're attracting and retaining people back of house so that you can actually accommodate the guests that want to eat in your restaurant. So again, I think there's lots of opportunity here, and the way that we're going to do it is to build is to take advantage of each part of the system rather than sitting back and expecting a single fix to take care of the problem.
And we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Glenn Spencer and Ardeen Williams, for joining us today. Again, an access or a version of this recording will be available so that you can all revisit it. Appreciate you both very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Sage.
Thank you.